The wind cut through the open plains like a knife, carrying dust, cold, and the weight of another hopeless day. Her boots were worn thin, her dress torn and faded from too many nights sleeping in barns and alleys. Every step she took sank into the frozen dirt, and still she walked. There was no place left to go, no one left who cared. The town behind her had turned its back long ago. She had begged, pleaded, even tried to work, but the world had grown cruel. So she kept walking, hoping for a miracle, or maybe just a place to stop feeling so alone. Up ahead, she saw a small light flickering in the distance. A cabin, maybe. Smoke rose from a chimney, and the faint glow of firelight danced against the dark horizon. Her heart tightened. People said nothing good waited on the edge of the valley. The man who lived there was said to be strange, dangerous, and scarred beyond recognition. Still, cold desperation doesn't care about stories. She wrapped her arms around herself and headed toward the light. By the time she reached the cabin, her fingers were numb and her lips trembling. The storm had grown louder, the wind biting through her thin clothes. She hesitated at the door, afraid to knock, afraid of what kind of man might open it. But when thunder rolled above her head, she forced her shaking hand to tap lightly on the wood. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then she heard slow, heavy footsteps from inside. The door creaked open, and she found herself staring at a man whose presence filled the doorway. He was tall, easily 6 foot or more, with shoulders broad enough to block out the firelight behind him. A deep scar ran down his face, half hidden beneath the shadow of his unshaven jaw. His eyes, cold and steady, studied her like a stranger studies a storm. She tried to speak, but her voice cracked. "Please," she whispered, "I just need a place to stay. I'll work, I'll cook, I can do anything." The man didn't answer right away. The fire behind him crackled softly, and for a moment she thought he might turn her away. Then with a slow, quiet voice he said, "Come in." She stepped inside, her boots dragging mud and snow across the wooden floor. The warmth of the cabin hit her like a wave, making her shiver harder. It wasn't much, just a single room with a stove, a wooden table, and a few shelves. But compared to the frozen night outside, it felt like heaven. The man closed the door behind her, shutting out the wind, and for a second the silence between them was louder than the storm. He set the lantern on the table, its soft light revealing the rest of the room. There was a bed against the far wall, neatly made, and a worn armchair by the fire. Tools hung from the wall beside the door, axes, rope, and a coat that looked older than she was. Everything about the place was simple, orderly, and untouched by anything gentle. She clutched her hands together, unsure what to say. He moved slowly, his heavy boots thudding against the floor as he crossed to the stove. Without looking at her, he poured hot water from a kettle into a tin cup and set it on the table. "Sit," he said. His voice was deep, rough, like it had been scraped against stone too many times. She obeyed, perching on the edge of the chair as if the wood might bite. He handed her the cup. The steam rose up, carrying the faint smell of coffee. Her hands trembled as she took it, letting the heat soak into her frozen fingers. She tried to thank him, but her throat was too tight. He finally looked at her, really looked. His eyes were sharp, gray, and unflinching, but not cruel. "What are you doing out here?" he asked. She swallowed, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I was looking for work or shelter." "In this weather," she nodded, embarrassed. "I didn't have anywhere else to go." He grunted, leaning back slightly. The firelight caught the scar across his face, a pale line that ran from his temple down past his jaw. He didn't seem to care if she noticed. "You from town?" "I was," she said softly. "Not anymore." That seemed to be enough for him. He didn't press her. Instead, he moved to the stove, filled another cup, and drank in silence. The only sounds were the wind rattling the shutters and the fire popping in the stove. After a while, she found her courage again. "People say things about you," she said before she could stop herself. His hand paused midair. "Do they now?" She nodded, staring into the cup. "They say you don't like visitors. That you live out here 'cause you can't stand people." He gave a small, humorless laugh. "They're not wrong." Something in his tone made her look up. There was no anger, no threat, just truth. He set the cup down and leaned his elbows on his knees. I got tired of Bane, a story people told when they ran out of gossip, so I came here. Suits me fine. She hesitated. Then why let me in? He stared into the fire for a long moment. You knocked, he said simply. Didn't seem right to turn you back into that storm. For the first time since she'd met him, something like warmth flickered behind his eyes. She didn't know what to say, so she just nodded and took another sip. The drink wasn't sweet, but it burned going down, thawing the chill that had settled deep inside her bones. He stood and grabbed a blanket from a shelf. You can sleep there, he said, pointing to a small cot near the fire. Ain't much, but it's warm. Thank you, she whispered. He didn't answer. He just nodded once, then walked to the far side of the cabin where his bed was. He sat down with a heavy sigh, his back to her. The firelight painted his shadow large against the wall, broad shoulders, strong arms, a man built to endure. But there was something broken in the way he held himself, like a tree that had survived one too many storms. She lay down, pulling the blanket around herself. The smell of wood smoke and pine filled her lungs. Her eyes grew heavy, but her mind wouldn't rest. Who was this man who lived so far from everything, scarred and silent, yet still kind enough to open his door to a stranger? Sometime in the night, she woke to the sound of him moving. The fire had burned low, and the room glowed faintly with the light of dying embers. She watched as he knelt by the stove, adding more wood with careful hands. When the flames caught again, his face lit up in soft orange. He looked older than she'd thought, worn, yes, but not unkind. He must have sensed her watching because he turned his head slightly. Can't sleep, she shook her head. I didn't mean to wake you. You didn't, he said. I don't sleep much. Because of the storm, he paused, his eyes distant. No, just some storms don't stop when the weather clears. The words hung in the air, and she felt something tighten in her chest. She wanted to ask more, but his tone said enough. He stood, gave the fire one last look, and said, Get some rest. Tomorrow'll come early. When morning broke, pale sunlight slipped through the cracks in the shutters. She sat up slowly, the blanket sliding off her shoulders. The man was already outside, his silhouette moving across the yard through a thin layer of snow. She watched from the doorway as he worked, feeding the horses, chopping wood, checking fences, all without hurry, all without complaint. When he came back in, his breath fogged in the cold air. You can help with the chores if you plan on staying a while, he said, his voice even. I can work, she said quickly. I'm a good worker. He studied her for a moment. We'll see. And that was how it began. She swept the floors, washed the dishes, helped with the horses, and learned how to start the fire the way he showed her. The silence between them was heavy at first, filled only with the sounds of work. But now and then she caught him glancing her way, checking, maybe, to see if she'd quit like others had before her. She didn't. She couldn't. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't running. She was surviving. And though the cabin was small and the man was quiet, she could feel something stirring beneath all the stillness, like the faintest warmth returning after years of winter. Days passed slowly at the ranch, each one shaped by the rhythm of work and silence. The woman rose before dawn, just as the light began to slip over the mountains, and helped wherever she could. The chores were endless, feeding the animals, mending fences, hauling water, chopping wood, but she didn't mind. Every task, no matter how hard, gave her something she hadn't felt in a long time: purpose. The cold air bit at her skin, but it reminded her she was still alive. And though the man said little, she could sense he was beginning to notice her effort. At first he gave her simple tasks, carrying feed, cleaning the barn. But when he saw how she handled herself, steady, patient, never complaining, he started trusting her with more. She learned how to saddle a horse, how to fix a broken latch, and how to gather firewood before the storms rolled in. He didn't offer praise, not in words, but sometimes when she caught his gaze, she could see it in his eyes. That was enough. The days were cold, the nights colder. Yet somehow the cabin no longer felt empty. She'd grown used to the way he moved quietly through the space, his heavy boots across the wooden floor, the low creak of the chair when he sat by the fire. He still rarely smiled, but every so often, a faint softness crossed his face when he looked her way. He'd started leaving small things for her without saying a word. A pair of gloves near the door, a thicker blanket folded neatly on her cot. She didn't ask why. She just whispered thank you when he wasn't listening. Sometimes she'd catch him staring out the window in the evenings, his face distant, lost in thought. The scar down his cheek glowed faintly in the firelight, and she wondered what kind of pain had left its mark there, not just on his skin, but deep inside. She wanted to ask, but something about him warned her not to pry. Some stories, she knew too well, weren't ready to be told. One morning she found him sitting at the table, cleaning an old rifle. The sun hadn't yet risen, and the light from the lantern threw long shadows across the room. She hesitated before speaking. "You always get up this early," he nodded without looking up. "Old habits. Hard to sleep in a quiet house." She smiled faintly. "You don't like quiet." He glanced at her then, just for a moment. "Quiet's fine. It's the kind that comes after noise that gets to me." She didn't ask what that meant. She didn't need to. She understood too well the kind of silence that comes after a storm, the heavy kind, filled with memories that don't fade. When she took the coffee pot off the stove, she poured him a cup without asking and slid it across the table. He took it, his rough hand brushing hers for only a second. It was nothing, a simple touch, but it sent warmth through her chest that lingered long after. Later that day, while tending the horses, she saw a group of riders approaching from the distance. Dust trailed behind them as they neared the ranch. She froze, heart pounding. Strangers were never a good sign out here. She called out to him, and within seconds he was beside her, rifle in hand. The riders slowed as they reached the fence line, 3 men, all wearing long coats and wide-brimmed hats. The one in front raised his hand. "Mornin', Luke," he called. So that was his name, she thought. He hadn't told her before. The man, Luke, didn't answer right away. "What do you want, Carter?" he said finally, his voice cold and steady. "Just passing through," the rider replied. "Heard you had company, a woman, they said." His grin was sharp. "Didn't think you were the kind to share your roof anymore." Her stomach turned. She could feel their eyes on her even from a distance. Luke stepped forward, his voice low but firm. "You heard wrong. Now get off my land." The men laughed, but something in Luke's tone made them think twice. After a tense moment, Carter tipped his hat. "Didn't mean no trouble. Enjoy your solitude, old friend." They turned their horses and rode off, the sound of hoofbeats fading into the wind. Luke watched them until they disappeared over the hill. Then he turned to her. "You all right?" She nodded, though her hands still shook. "Who were they?" "People who don't belong here," he said quietly. "Don't worry, they won't come back." But she saw the way his jaw tightened, the way his hand lingered near the rifle even after they were gone. That night he double-bolted the door before bed. After that, something in the air shifted. Luke grew quieter again, more guarded, but not toward her, toward the world outside. She caught him checking the windows at night, his eyes scanning the dark. Still, he never said a word about it. One evening, as snow began to fall outside, she found him fixing the latch on the door. She approached slowly. "Luke," she said softly, testing the sound of his name. He looked up, surprised. "I just wanted to thank you," she continued, "for letting me stay, for everything." He wiped his hands on a rag and met her gaze. "You don't owe me thanks." "I do," she insisted. "You didn't have to open that door." He sighed, leaning against the frame. "Maybe not, but maybe I needed to." She didn't know what he meant, but the way he said it made her heart ache. For the first time, she saw not just the scars on his face, but the pain behind them. The kind a person carries for years and learns to live with, even when it never stops hurting. When she turned to walk away, he called after her. "You did good with the horses today." She froze, then smiled softly. It was the first kind word he'd ever given her. "Thank you," she said, and when she looked back, she could have sworn she saw something like a smile ghost across his lips. That night she lay awake long after the fire went out. The sound of the wind against the cabin walls was softer now, like a lullaby instead of a threat. She thought of how far she'd come, from sleeping in ditches to having a roof over her head, from being invisible to being seen. For the first time in a long time, she felt safe. And maybe, just maybe, she wasn't the only one in that cabin who needed saving. The winter deepened, and the cold grew sharper with each passing night. Snow covered the ground in thick layers, and the mountains disappeared behind gray clouds. Life at the ranch became quiet and slow, marked only by the crackle of the fire and the sound of boots on wooden floors. The woman had grown used to the silence, but there was something peaceful about it now, something safe. Luke didn't talk much, but he didn't have to. His presence filled the space like the steady rhythm of a heartbeat. Each morning he rose before dawn to tend to the animals. She would wake to the sound of the door closing softly behind him, then start the fire and make coffee. When he came back inside, his coat dusted with snow, he would nod his thanks as she handed him a steaming cup. It became their quiet ritual. No words, just understanding. Sometimes, while he worked outside, she'd watch from the window. The way he moved, strong and deliberate, was like watching someone carve meaning out of loneliness. His scar no longer frightened her. She barely noticed it anymore. What she saw now was a man who carried pain without bitterness, who found peace in hard work and solitude. But peace has a way of drawing attention from the world, and the world rarely leaves good things alone. It was late one afternoon when the sound of approaching hooves broke the stillness. She froze, a chill running through her. Luke was out by the barn. She stepped onto the porch, clutching her shawl tight around her shoulders. 3 men rode toward the cabin, the same ones she'd seen before, the ones who had spoken to Luke with mockery in their voices. Their coats were dark, their faces hidden beneath the brims of their hats. Luke appeared from the side of the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. His expression didn't change, but his shoulders straightened. He walked toward the men, his steps slow and measured. "Afternoon, Luke," the one in front called, his tone too casual. "Heard you've got company again." Luke didn't respond. He stopped a few feet away from them, his stance firm. The man smiled thinly. "You always did have a soft spot for strays. Guess some things don't change." The woman's heart pounded. She recognized that voice, the same man who'd come before, the one who had known her name when no one else should have. "Carter," she whispered under her breath. He turned his gaze toward her then, his grin widening. "Well, if it ain't little Miss Runaway. Didn't expect to see you all the way out here." Luke's jaw tightened. "You need to leave," he said evenly. Carter dismounted slowly, brushing the snow off his coat. Now, no need to be unfriendly. I just came to collect what's mine." The words made her stomach drop. "I'm not yours," she said, her voice trembling but firm. He smirked. "Oh, you think you can just walk away from a debt? You owe me more than you remember, girl." Luke stepped forward, placing himself between them. "I said leave." Carter's grin faded. "You forget who you're talking to." He nodded toward his men, who shifted uneasily but didn't move closer. The tension hung thick in the air. Luke didn't raise his voice, but there was steel in it now. "You step 1 foot closer and you'll regret it." Carter laughed, though it didn't sound amused. "Still hiding behind that scar, huh? Still trying to be the hero?" Luke's hand twitched near his coat pocket. The woman could see the restraint in his posture, the kind that comes from a man who knows exactly what he's capable of. Finally, Carter spat into the snow and backed away. "Fine, keep her, but remember she's trouble, and trouble always finds a way back." He climbed onto his horse and turned to leave. "You can't save someone who don't want savin'." The words lingered long after the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance. The woman stood frozen on the porch, her hands shaking. Luke didn't look at her right away. He walked to the fence, staring into the horizon as if he could still see them there. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked quietly, not turning around. She swallowed hard. "I didn't think it mattered anymore." He looked back then, his eyes steady but full of something she hadn't seen before, hurt. "It matters when it brings danger to my door." "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I never wanted to bring you trouble." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You didn't. The trouble came looking for you. That's different." She wanted to say more, to explain the past she'd been trying so hard to outrun. But before she could, he turned back toward the cabin. Get inside, it's cold." That night the fire burned low. Luke sat in his chair by the window, rifle resting across his lap. She lay awake on her cot, staring at the ceiling. The shadows from the flames danced across the walls like ghosts of their pasts, his and hers both. Finally, she spoke into the quiet. "He wasn't lying. I did owe him money, but not like that. He offered me a place once, said I could work for what I owed. Then he wanted more. When I said no, he made sure no one else in town would hire me." Her voice cracked. "I had nowhere else to go. That's when I found your cabin." Luke didn't respond right away. His eyes stayed on the window. After a long moment he said, "You don't have to explain yourself to me." "I wanted to," she said softly. "You deserve the truth." He turned to her then, his expression unreadable. "Truth's a hard thing out here, but I'll tell you this, I don't care what you've done or where you came from. You're here now. That's what matters." Something broke open inside her at those words. The shame she'd been carrying for so long felt lighter, almost bearable. She turned toward the fire, watching the embers glow faintly in the dark. Outside, the wind picked up again, brushing snow against the window pane. But for the first time since she'd arrived, she didn't feel afraid. She had found something in that small cabin that felt stronger than fear, something she hadn't known she was still capable of feeling. Luke stayed by the window until dawn, keeping watch as the world outside slowly turned white again. When the morning light finally crept through the cracks in the shutters, he set the rifle aside and glanced at her sleeping form near the fire. The lines on his face softened, and for a fleeting second, a hint of peace crossed his features. The days after the confrontation passed in uneasy silence. The air between them was different now, heavier, thoughtful. Luke worked longer hours outside, fixing fences that didn't need fixing, chopping more wood than they could ever burn. She knew why. Men like him carried their worries through their hands, not their words. But even in his quiet, she could sense the weight pressing down on him, the same one she had carried for years, fear of losing what little peace they had found. She wanted to say something, but every time she tried, the words tangled in her throat. Instead, she worked harder, cooking, cleaning, tending to the animals. It was her way of saying thank you, her way of easing the tension that still lingered like smoke after a fire. At night, when he sat by the window with his rifle nearby, she would quietly place a cup of coffee beside him. He never asked for it, but he always drank it. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of gold and violet, she stood outside with a basket of laundry. The air smelled like pine and smoke. She looked toward the barn where Luke was working and caught herself smiling without meaning to. For the first time in years, her body felt steady, her mind calm. There was safety here, not the kind that came from locked doors or loaded guns, but the kind that came from being seen and not judged. She didn't hear him approach until he spoke. "You're thinking too hard." She turned, startled. He stood a few feet away, wiping his hands on a rag, his voice softer than usual. "I didn't hear you come up," she said, trying to hide her smile. "That's 'cause you were off in your head," he said. "You always get quiet like that when something's bothering you." "Maybe I just like the quiet," she said, looking back toward the hills. He studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Maybe." For a while they stood there in silence, the kind that didn't hurt anymore. Then he said, "You don't have to be afraid of that man. He won't come back." She looked at him, her eyes reflecting the fading light. "How can you be so sure?" "Because I know the kind," he said. "People like him, full of noise but empty inside. They get brave when someone else is scared, but you stood your ground. That changes things." His words sank deep, settling somewhere she'd kept locked away. She hadn't realized how much she needed to hear them until now. That night after supper, the wind howled outside, rattling the shutters. Luke tossed another log into the fire and the light flickered across his face. She watched him from across the room, the shadows softening his rough edges. He caught her staring, and for once didn't look away. "What?" he asked, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Nothing," she said quickly, her cheeks warm. "Didn't look like nothing." She hesitated, then laughed softly. "I was just thinking you don't smile much." He leaned back in his chair, the firelight glinting in his eyes. "Ain't had much reason to." "Maybe you do now," she said before she could stop herself. He looked at her for a long moment, then glanced at the fire. "Maybe I do," he said quietly. The conversation ended there, but something shifted in that moment, something unspoken, fragile, and real. They didn't need more words. The way he looked at her, the way she lingered near the fire when he was close, it all said enough. Winter began to fade, giving way to early spring. The snow melted into streams that trickled down the hills, and the grass returned, soft and green. The ranch came alive again, the animals restless, the air filled with the scent of earth and rain. One morning she woke to sunlight spilling across her blanket. Luke was already outside, mending the fence near the creek. She stepped onto the porch, barefoot, her hair falling loose around her shoulders. He looked up and smiled faintly when he saw her. It was small, almost shy, but it made her heart catch in her chest. She walked toward him, holding a tin cup of coffee. "You've been out here since dawn," she said. "Work doesn't do itself," he replied, taking the cup with a nod. "You should rest." He chuckled softly. "You sound like an old wife." She froze for half a second before he realized what he'd said. His face changed, a flicker of embarrassment crossing his features. "Didn't mean it like that," he muttered. "It's all right," she said quickly, though her heart was beating fast. "You didn't offend me." He met her eyes then, really met them, and something warm passed between them that neither could quite name. Later that day, she sat on the porch sewing a tear in one of his shirts while he worked nearby. The baby calf they'd been nursing back to health stumbled across the yard, and she laughed, an easy, natural laugh that made Luke glance over. He hadn't realized until that moment how much he loved the sound of her laughter. As the evening sun turned the sky pink, he joined her on the porch. "You did good with that calf," he said. "Couldn't have done it without you," she replied. "Maybe," he said, looking out at the land. "But you're the reason this place feels like something again." She turned to him, confused. "What do you mean?" He shrugged. "Used to be just walls and chores. You made it feel alive." Her breath caught, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The only sound was the soft rustle of wind through the trees and the creak of the porch under their boots. "Luke," she said finally, "when you first opened that door for me, why did you let me in?" He looked down at his hands, thinking. "Didn't know why then. Maybe I was tired of ghosts. Maybe I saw someone who needed a chance." He paused, then added softly, "Maybe I needed one too." She smiled, blinking back tears she didn't expect. "You gave me more than a chance. You gave me a home." He looked at her then, eyes steady and kind. "No," he said quietly. "You made one." The words hung between them like a secret promise. The fire inside the cabin flickered through the open door, and the scent of pine filled the cooling air. She looked at the man who had once been a stranger, a man feared by others, and saw not the scar on his face but the gentleness in his eyes. As the first stars began to appear above the horizon, Luke stood and offered her his hand. She hesitated only a second before taking it, feeling the warmth of his rough palm against hers. Neither of them spoke, but they didn't need to. Some stories, the truest ones, aren't told through words. They're lived, one quiet moment at a time, beneath a sky that's finally starting to clear. The air had begun to warm, carrying the scent of spring across the valley. The snow that had once buried the ranch was gone, leaving behind soft earth and fresh green grass. The mountains stood tall in the distance, their white caps melting under the sun. The world felt new again, alive in a way it hadn't been for months. Inside the cabin, laughter had replaced silence, and warmth had taken the place of fear. The woman, who had once arrived trembling and lost, now moved through the small home like she belonged there. Her steps were lighter, her eyes brighter. Even Luke had changed, though he'd never admit it. The edges of his voice had softened. His smiles came easier, quiet but real. The mornings began the same way they always had, with the smell of coffee and the sound of the fire crackling to life. But now there was conversation, small bits of it that filled the empty space. Sometimes she would tell him stories from before, little ones, the kind that didn't hurt to remember. He would listen quietly, nodding as he fixed the stove or mended a broken hinge. Other times, he'd tell her about the ranch in its younger years, when the fences were straight and the herds were plenty. She'd catch a glimpse of who he'd been before the scars, before the silence, before life hardened him into someone who lived only for routine. One morning she found him outside near the corral, hammer in hand, repairing a broken gate. The sun had just risen, and golden light spilled across the land, catching in his dark hair. She stood on the porch, watching for a moment before calling out, "You missed a spot." He turned, smirking. "You sure about that?" She walked down toward him, her dress brushing against the tall grass. "I've been watching long enough to know when you're pretending it's fixed." He chuckled, shaking his head. "You think you can do better?" "Maybe," she said, crossing her arms. He handed her the hammer. "Then show me." The tool was heavier than she expected, but she refused to let him see her struggle. He stood back, arms folded, as she knelt to fit the nail into place. It took her 3 tries to line it right, but when she finally hit it in straight, she looked up proud. "There," she said, brushing the dust from her skirt. He nodded, pretending to study her work. "Not bad. Still crooked, though." She frowned at him, and he laughed, really laughed. The sound was deep and warm, echoing across the open field. It startled her at first, but then she smiled, realizing how rare that sound was. "I think it's perfect," she said. "Maybe it is," he said quietly, his eyes softening as he looked at her. The rest of the day passed easily. They worked side by side, fixing the fences, clearing branches left behind by the storm. The rhythm of it felt natural. 2 people who didn't need to fill every moment with words because the quiet between them said enough. When evening came, they sat on the porch, watching the sky turn pink and gold as the sun sank behind the hills. She leaned back, feeling the warmth of the wood beneath her and the peace that had taken root deep in her chest. Luke handed her a cup of tea, the steam curling into the cool air. "You ever think about going back?" he asked suddenly. She turned to him, surprised. "Back where?" "Wherever you came from, the town, the people." She shook her head slowly. "There's nothing there for me anymore." He nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Sometimes that's how it goes. You lose everything you thought mattered, and somehow you find something better when you stop looking." She studied his face in the fading light. The scar that once seemed harsh now looked like part of him, proof that he'd survived what others might not have. "Is that what happened to you?" she asked softly. He took a sip of his tea, his expression distant. "Maybe. I used to think I was done. Thought this ranch would be the place I'd grow old in alone. Then you showed up on my porch in the middle of a storm, knocking like the world was endin'. Guess maybe that was my second chance." Her throat tightened, but she didn't speak. Instead, she reached over and placed her hand over his. For a moment, he didn't move. Then slowly, he turned his palm upward, letting her fingers rest against his rough skin. The warmth between them was quiet but powerful, the kind of connection that didn't need to be explained. As the last light faded, he stood and walked toward the old oak tree near the cabin. She followed him, curious. There, beneath its branches, she saw something new, a wooden cross, freshly carved, standing beside the weathered one that had been there since before she arrived. The ground around it was soft, freshly turned. "I buried her here," he said, his voice low. "My wife, a long time ago." The words hung heavy in the air. She stepped closer, her heart aching for him. "I never thought I'd care for anyone again," he continued. "Didn't think I had it in me, but life, it's strange. It gives back when you least expect it." She swallowed hard. "I'm sorry, Luke." He looked at her, a faint smile touching his lips. "Don't be. She'd be glad I wasn't alone anymore." The night settled softly around them, the wind whispering through the branches. She stood beside him, and together they looked out across the ranch, the land that had become both their burden and their peace. Later, when they returned to the cabin, the fire burned low. She added another log and watched the flames rise, casting warm light across the walls. Luke sat in his chair, quiet as always, but his eyes followed her as she moved through the room. There was something new there now, a gentleness, an ease that hadn't existed before. When she finally sat down across from him, she said softly, I used to think I was cursed. Everywhere I went, people looked at me like I didn't belong, but here I do." He didn't answer right away. Then he said, "You do belong, always did." The fire crackled between them, filling the silence. She smiled, small but real. Outside, the night stretched across the valley, calm and endless. Inside, the cabin glowed with a quiet warmth, two lives mending in their own time. And as the wind carried the faint scent of rain and pine through the open window, the woman who once came begging for shelter sat beneath a roof that was now her home, beside a man who had once shut out the world but now had someone worth keeping it open for.